Right now I call on Professor Vicziany, who will be speaking on EU sanctions on Iran and the Indian reaction. Professor.
Thanks, David. Okay, perhaps I'll just begin with a few preliminary comments about our methodology. Because Pascaline and I come to this book from completely opposite angles. And we're not actually quite sure how the two sections are going to meet up. And this is the first time I've heard Pascaline talking about her part of the book, which is the first part. And this will be the first occasion on which Pascaline is going to hear me talking about the second part of the book. We're each responsible for about 4 chapters. And of course, Poonam Datta, who worked as a postgraduate with Pascaline, has also written a chapter on EU development aid to India. Now, in this methodological conundrum, we've got some real issues. And what I really enjoyed this morning, Pascaline, about hearing about you is I kept saying, my God, how the world has changed. Because when I told trustworthy friends in India about our book, as I said to you then, they said, why are you wasting your time? Now, if you told us you were going to write about India and China, of course. And of course, you've written about India and the US, that makes a lot of sense. But why waste your time talking about the EU and India? Who cares? Really very interesting reaction. And in some of our interviews, or rather in my interviews, I've asked various members of the Indian elite, what do they think about the EU? And discovered that basically they never think about the EU. And when they start thinking about the EU, they think not about the EU as such, not the EU as an actor, but the individual countries in the EU. And then fortunately, I came across the work of a British academic who's got a terrific article about what is the EU actually. And that's a problem that I've been struggling with. Who is the actor? You know, is the EU acting qua EU, or is it acting qua various countries, or are the real actors the individuals, or is actually the EU just a nice way of talking about a conspiracy between the 3 big ones, Britain, France and Germany, and everyone else has to fall in line, which it often looks like that. So there's some very interesting methodological issues here, which I thought I'd begin with because we haven't yet figured out how to write that introductory chapter that will deal with these issues. From my position, what's been fantastic in working with Pascaline is that she's on top of all the dialogues, the agreements, the summits, all that stuff, which I have difficulty taking most of these summits seriously. My strength, if I have such a thing, I'd like to think I might, is what I thought I knew about India. But actually, what's been fantastic in the last 3 or 4 months is I've discovered, again, how little I really do know about India. And I've really been, running at a huge speed to catch up and update and reassess all these relationships, because this book, although it's about the EU and India, cannot be written without looking at EU-India, US relations, EU-India, China relations, EU-India, Iran relations, and so on. So it's kind of the EU-India in a bigger global context. And that's why Pascaline's first few chapters are so important, because they remind us that until fairly recently, there was a time when Europe did lead the world in terms of its organizational capacities and so on. And it did seem as if the European Common Market would do all these fantastic things apart from prevent World War III between Germany and France. So interesting to then compare that earlier world with what we now have, such that, as I speak, Manmohan Singh is now in Tehran, the Iranian government has resurrected the non-aligned movement, excuse me, started by whom? By Kwame Nkrumah, Sukarno, and Nehru. You know, I was brought up on the smell of the non-aligned movement. To me, it was, wow, the 60s, when even in Perth, we thought that a nuclear war was going to break out because of the Bay of Pigs and the standoff between US and USSR missiles. The height of the Cold War was also the beginning of the non-aligned movement in Africa, Southeast Asia, and India. Now, the non-aligned movement is meeting this week in Tehran, where Nehru's ghost is sort of stalking the scene, and people are reminding the audience of how all this started. But we have Manmohan Singh shaking hands with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. We've got the prelude in the lead up to the NAM movement in Tehran this week. India, Iran and Afghanistan had a special meeting to look at common security interests, in particular about infrastructure and port development that I'll come to in a minute. The Ayatollah Khamenei issued, his opening speech that you can read on the web is very interesting. It begins fairly softly and then it builds up a great crescendo and denounces various science, conspiracies and so on. But in many parts of his speech it's quite muted. And then there's Manmohan Singh gave a speech yesterday to the non-aligned movement. And there are about 120, 150 nations participating in this. And they're all saying to each other, we represent the new world. We have a role because now we don't have the Cold War. We have a unilateral world led by the US, and now the non-aligned movement can spring back into existence. This is a very important moment for us to be actually assessing the sort of thing that Pascaline and I are doing, to see how far things have shifted or perhaps not shifted. And incidentally, Iran is going to be the chair of the non-aligned movement for the next 3 years. So it's going to be very interesting to look at that. So I want to focus today on only one small part of the third chapter that I've written as an example of how the world has changed. EU sanctions on Iran and Indian reactions. This is the second part, the largest part of my third chapter, which deals with the EU and India security arrangements or security situations. I had no conclusion when I began writing this chapter. I had no conclusion for the other chapters either. I discovered all of this. To be honest, I had no methodology, except I knew that Pascaline can look at all the agreements and summits. And I would try and figure out what was happening on the ground. And I didn't really have any idea what I was doing. I kind of stumbled upon all of this. And in this final third chapter of mine, I stumbled upon some astonishing things in addition to the sanctions stuff. There are two other case studies. One is the case study of the Galileo project that you may have heard of. The European Union tried to challenge US supremacy by inventing its own independent GPS system, saying it didn't want to have anything to do with the American GPS system, which was driven by military objectives. And then it invited various companies to join, it invited India and China to join. And interestingly enough, India got out of this arrangement soon after it began because the EU wanted Indian money and Chinese money, but they were not willing to give India any actual control in the management of the new GPS technologies that they were developing. So my conclusion here is that, unusually for the EU actually wanted to develop something new in the world security system, but it failed to do it because India walked off. And then, and this is truly amazing, China stayed on with the EU. China was thrilled that the EU wanted to challenge the US about anything. But guess what? The EU asked China to get out. it asked China to leave because when the European companies pulled out, the financing of the Galileo system became taxpayer money, and the European Union said, oh, now we've got a different regime, we can't accept your technology, blah, 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 please leave. Imagine Europe asking China to please leave this so-called terribly important unit. What an insult to China. And China said, okay, we'll leave, but when are you going to give us our money back? Because they put in 200 million euros. Amazing stories that I haven't known anything about that are part of this book. But the Galileo system shows that when the European Union tried to be tough on security, it actually all kind of blew up in its face because of bureaucratic and financial and technical incompetencies. The project continues, and I won't go into what the ultimate outcome will be, but in terms of a security project, it's been a true embarrassment. The other case study in this chapter is about the US-India civilian nuclear deal, and that demonstrates how the EU is basically a very lazy institution. They never come up with any new ideas, and basically, yeah, the US, okay, tick it off. Fine, let India come into the nuclear club. It's quite, but how that happens is also very, very interesting. So this is the third case study of EU sanctions on Iran and Indian reactions to it. Oh my God, I better start moving. The location, Iran. Very important to remember that for India, Iran is a force of stability. In the West, there may be a perception that Iran is fundamentally unstable, difficult, ruled by fundamentalists, etc. But the Indian perception is that this is a country of predictability and stability. And it is. I visited Iran in May this year, and I was really shocked by the level of development. The first thing I said to my husband is, Oliver, this is a developed country. This is a competent country. This competence, this development, this domestic stability, and the basic consensus in Iran about fundamental questions of national interest are far more important for us to understand than this fundamentalism stuff. Regime change in Iran is not going to make any difference to Iran's realpolitik. I mean, it might soften the attitude on Palestinian questions and Israel and so on, but the fundamental realpolitik of Iran will not change even with regime change. And on this, I'm not being at all original. I'm quoting Professor Bialik from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and that was his analysis, and I kind of agree with that. So, and because India is confronted by enormous instability in Pakistan and Afghanistan, Iran is even more important to India. What are India's interests in Iran? So before, in my methodology, before I leap into the US stuff, I thought, well, what does India care about Iran? And of course, it cares a hell of a lot. India imports up to 13% of its crude oil from Iran. It has developed a new port, which you could see in that previous map. If I can go back to it, I won't bother. The port of Chabahar is on Iranian soil, developed with Indian capital. It's in order to access, if anything goes wrong in the Persian Gulf, Iran can send its oil and gas overland to Chabahar, and from there it can go to India, either by sea, or now there are discussions about an underground sea cable, and there were very old discussions about land cables via Pakistan and also Afghanistan. And of course, also, India hopes to access through Chabahar the oil and gas of Central Asia, and most important of all, and little known, India's interest in Afghanistan. One of the world's biggest iron ore mines is starting operation in Afghanistan, not far from Bamiyan, where those fabulous Buddha statues were blown up. And 75% of this massive oil field, massive iron field, is being developed by an Indian consortium led by SAIL, which is a government enterprise in India. China is Iran's most important trading partner and biggest purchaser of oil. And as a result of EU sanctions, that's become a greater dependency. When we walked around the streets of Tehran, or Isfahan, or Shiraz, or even a small town in the middle, Yazd, we were astonished. You can buy anything you want to buy in Iran. Hair dryers, washing machines, laptops, pizza, whatever. Freely available, all coming from China, South Korea, Japan, and India hopes increasingly from India. And all of this relationship sits in the context of a massive trade deficit that India has with Iran. So, India imports about $13 billion worth of oil a year, 1-3, and exports about $2 to $3 billion worth of various things to Iran. So one of the things behind Manmohan Singh going to the non-aligned conference, and in the days leading up to the non-aligned conference, yesterday and today, have been discussions on trade. And, you know, India's not stupid here. India's there pushing its trade. So here I'm listening to Pascaline about how India was pushing for trade with the EU, and Britain, please don't abandon us, who will drink our tea? To today, India doesn't care about that. It's looking to China, it's looking to Australia, and above all, it's looking to Iran. I've just got a couple of slides here to remind us of how the Persian Gulf is unstable and therefore why the port of Chabahar is so important. Chabahar sits outside the Gulf, and long before you get to the Straits of Hormuz, which is the entry point into the Persian Gulf, right? So the Persian Gulf came into prominence early this year in January. There was a standoff between Iran, the US, and Europe. The Straits of Hormuz were threatened, the Iranians threatened to lock it down, and there was, you know, some very nasty diplomatic exchanges. Major General Salehi, who's commander of the Iranian army, was standing in the port of Chabahar making these statements about we will not repeat our warning, if you continue sanctions against us, we will respond. And of course, Iran, to demonstrate that it was serious, also had a couple of missile drills in the region. An important factor in this instability is the realization that the US will pull out of Afghanistan from 2014 onwards in a very serious way. So again, basically Pakistan and Afghanistan, terrible quadrants of instability with India and Iran stable. You know, and I was thinking, actually, if only Iran could get over its fundamentalism, because the average person in Iran may be very religious, but they're not ostentatiously fundamentalist. And I've been thinking all year, wouldn't it be extraordinary if the two most stable powers in the Middle East got their act together? The two reliable, dependable, stable powers, which are Iran and Israel. Imagine what the world would look like then. I just put it out there as a theory that some of you may think, this is ridiculous. But actually, that's what I learned about Iran, the stability of it and its dependability. This is a map showing the railway line that is now being discussed again in Tehran this week, that the government of India wants to build with the Afghan government and with the Iranian government to run alongside a road, an Iranian road, that already goes from the port of Chabahar up to, excuse me, what have I done? From the port of Chabahar in the south up to the Iranian-Afghan border and directly into Afghanistan. Oh, and incidentally, next to Chabahar, on the Pakistani side of the border, is the port of Gwadar, which was built by Chinese capital. Now, I won't go into that, but that in itself is also a very interesting story. But don't forget, I did also say that China is the #1 trading partner and oil purchaser for Iran. And this is just another map showing the size and value of the iron, copper, and other deposits. And again, as we speak, India is putting in a tender to develop a new copper and gold mine in Afghanistan. And those minerals are going to be exported via Iran, most likely, because you can't export via Pakistan because the Taliban in Pakistan, either the Pakistani Taliban or the Afghanistani Taliban, have been blowing up convoys, as you know. And incidentally, I also came across a rumor suggesting that NATO forces, which are now drawing down their presence in Afghanistan, are using the road from the Afghan-Iranian border to Chabahar to get NATO's equipment and personnel out of Afghanistan. So the thing about the US and US sanctions is, the US is tough over here, and over here through the left eye it's kind of blind. Lots of things have enabled Iran to overcome sanctions, and the US has not been vicious. It's deliberately left loopholes open for Iran to negotiate its way out of imminent collapse. And I thought, now I don't know if these rumors can be substantiated, I'm trying to work on that. Are NATO forces using the Iranian port of Chabahar to get out of Afghanistan? Now that leaves me with, well, no time to talk about the sanctions, but basically, UN sanctions on Iran are nicely summarized here. On the 23rd of January this year, the EU sanctions, the EU put an oil embargo on all oil trade between the EU and all member countries and Iran. Purchases, sales, finance, old contracts, new contracts, future contracts, total blockout, total freeze, which came into full force on the 1st of July, plus a freeze on foreign assets owned by the Central Bank of Iran. Followed on the 17th of March by disconnecting all the entire Iranian banking system from SWIFT. So a lot of people here, you know what a SWIFT code is. It's that bank code that appears in front of your area code and your bank account number. So Iran has been disconnected from the international internet banking system, which is controlled by the EU. And then on the 23rd of April this year, and there's been a subsequent document after that, the EU Council released a fact sheet summarizing all of its sanctions against Iran, including visa bans and the freezing of other assets. The whole point of these embargoes and asset freezes is to prevent Iran from having any money to develop nuclear technology. Okay, so why has the EU done this? Because historically, EU sanctions are about human rights. There have been previous EU sanctions against Iran, but there are individuals or entities associated with human rights abuses or crimes against democracy and so on. So why has this happened? And there are many puzzles here which I can't go into, because the EU typically doesn't talk tough. As I said earlier, it's a lazy institution. One academic called Carla Portela says, the EU is a very strong actor, but only on the East European border. Now, Iran is nowhere near the East European border, right? Many scholars say, when you're looking at the EU, you have to focus on values and normative frameworks, not pragmatic responses. You know, so again, what are these sanctions? The sanctions contradict all these assumptions about the European Union. And finally, of course, UN and US sanctions already exist. So why does the EU have to do any of this? And the answer lies in the release of the International Atomic Energy Agency report of the 8th of November 2011. In late last year, the IAEA released a report that totally freaked out Europe. And in the appendix to that report, which is quite long, there's a detailed list of all the evidence assembled by the IAEA, which they submit is evidence that Iran is developing clandestine weapons technology using nuclear power. Because the Iranian position has been nuclear weapons are evil. And not only evil, but we want nuclear technology for civilian purposes, for radioisotopes and for energy. But this IAEA report says the exact opposite, and quote, Iran has carried out activities relevant to the development of a nuclear explosive device. And it, IAEA, we are unable to provide credible assurance to conclude that all nuclear material in Iran is in peaceful activities. Now, I'll just mention this, but I won't talk about it. Please remember that Iran signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that all of Iran's nuclear reactors are open to IAEA inspections, right? Please remember that India has never signed a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, but was then welcomed into the global nuclear club on the assurance that it would never use a nuclear weapon. Now, India's image as a non-proliferator is, I think, deserved. India deserves that image because it's been very cluey in how it's developed its nuclear energy and its nuclear weapons. Iran has made a number of terrible strategic mistakes that give the impression to everyone that they're very aggressive and they've also got nuclear weapons. And because they're so aggressive, there's the threat, the unknown threat hanging over everyone's head, they might well use it. But for the record, Iran has signed non-proliferation treaties, making it open to inspection, and India hasn't. But India has been forced to now allow inspections of its civilian reactors, not its military reactors, not dual usage reactors, meaning civilian and military. And no future reactors can be examined by the IAEA. So there's very knotty questions here. But Iran has got a bad image, India's got a good image as a responsible nuclear power. Now, what was the reaction? Basically, Europe immediately reacted to the IAEA report in a very strong negative way, which is perfectly understandable. Long before the EU sanctions kicked in, Britain delinked Iran from the London banking system. It talked to Canada and the US, and then the UK also cut off more Iranian banks. Iran then threatened to reduce diplomatic relations, and the next thing we had on the 29th of November last year is the British embassy in Tehran was attacked, as you see here, by allegedly students, and everybody who knows anything about Iran knows that you wouldn't dare attack anything if you're a student in Iran, and I think it's reasonable to suggest that these student protests were certainly encouraged, if not orchestrated, by the government of Iran. According to the British ambassador, who lost his home and had to leave, the attacks were orchestrated by the Iranian government. And ultimately, the EU sanctions kicked in. The EU sanctions kicked in on the 23rd of January in response to the IAEA report, but also the violence associated with the attacks on the British embassy. Those two things which really made the Europeans irate. Now, how does India react to all of this? Pragmatic. On the one hand, India says, we accept and will conform to all sanctions. We will follow EU sanctions, UN sanctions, US sanctions. But not to the detriment of our international trade. All right? And we've got a huge trade deficit with India, and I've already told you the story of what's happening as we speak in Tehran. So India is sort of balancing its act here. You see, India's got to be careful because it's got huge business interests in the US. If India contravenes US sanctions, it will be excluded from the US market. If India contravenes EU sanctions, India will be excluded from the EU market. But it's not going to happen because India's already reduced its imports of oil from Iran. So it's reduced its imports of oil from Iran, which kind of it doesn't mind doing anyway to bring the trade balance into a better equilibrium. But it's also using this opportunity to actually expand trade. And there are trade deals going on as we speak. Conclusion. A conclusion I've come to, I had no idea I was moving in this direction, but the 3 case studies say to me, EU-India security interests are irreconcilable and incompatible. And there's no future in any collaboration on that. Neither is there any future in India or the EU collaborating, by the way, on agricultural exports or imports. That's my other argument in the other chapter. But on industry and FDI and technology exchange, there is a significant area of future and current collaboration. So no on security, no on agriculture, but definitely yes on industry and foreign direct investment collaborations. Sorry, so it's taken so long. I do apologize.